Today we are talking about none other than Sean Combs, aka
Diddy.
He is the man named after the popular saying,
No Diddy.
This man has been accused to have caused a lot of havoc in both adults and kids. Some claim he messed up their childhood. And in his recent case, many thought it's time for him to pay for his alleged action. But what if I told you that might not be happening? At least not in the way that you thought. And he might have just gotten a chance to get his life back. Watch as I unveil that to you. Caution though, for me to put this video together, I had to rely on secondary sources, so everything in here is bound by the major word, allegedly. Also, I need to ask you a personal favor. I only have one subscriber, and to be honest, that's me on another account. So I would appreciate if you found it in you to be my day one. Now on to the video. The indictment alleged that over many years he used his business empire to orchestrate freak-offs, coerced and manipulated women, arranged for travel of sex workers including controlled substances, and used his employees to facilitate and conceal these acts, which led him to have multiple federal charges, as you can see on your screen. These charges, if proven, could have led him serving 20 years in prison or even life. But how was it possible for the sentence to reduce to possibly 0? That's what we are going to discuss in today's episode, Evidence versus Lawyers Debunked. Let's start with the first charge. Of course, we'll start with the easier one as we get to the more complicated levels. Obstruction of justice. The law criminalizes knowingly using intimidation, threats, or corrupt persuasion to influence, delay, or prevent the testimony of a witness in an official proceeding, or cause a person to withhold, alter, or destroy documents or evidence relevant to a federal investigation or proceeding. In order to convict under that law, the prosecution must prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant knew of federal proceeding or investigation and intended to obstruct or impede it. The defendant engaged in conduct that could reasonably affect the testimony of a witness or the preservation of documents and/or evidence. Also, they must also prove that the conduct had direct relationship to the official proceeding or investigation. The prosecution must also prove that the defendant acted willfully, not accidentally or negligently. The prosecution presented evidence of a video depicting a violent altercation between Combs and his former partner Casey Ventura, which was the evidence that they believed had been suppressed by Sean Combs. This was followed by a testimony from his former partner Casey Ventura, who testified that during a phone call, Combs allegedly tried to influence her to withhold or suppress the video evidence of their altercation. And a testimony from hotel security guard Eddie Garcia, who testified that Combs gave him $100,000 in cash in a brown paper bag to secure or suppress the video recording of the altercation with Ventura. Now let's see how the defense team debunked these arguments. The defense claimed that Combs did not personally possess the video, and so he did not have control over it. It was recorded by a hotel employee, allegedly. There was no evidence of a written or verbal directive from Combs instructing anyone to suppress or withhold the recording. They also claimed recordings' existence and chain of custody were unclear. There were gaps in who had access to the video and when. Original recording devices and storage media were handled by multiple employees, some of whom left the hotel before trial. The defense presented log sheets and hotel policies showing multiple points where the video could have been copied or altered, noting that the recording was never in Combs' possession and the chain from creation to submission in court had breaks, raising reasonable doubt about its authenticity. About the $100,000 that Eddie Garcia received, the defense presented testimony that Combs had a history of giving Garcia and other staff personal gifts or bonuses and related to official proceedings. They cited emails, text messages, and payrolls and/or bonuses records showing previous financial gifts from Combs to hotel employees, thus claiming that the $100,000 could plausibly fall into the pattern rather than being a bribe. The defense also questioned Garcia's motives, as cross-examination highlighted that Garcia may have sought personal gain from telling his story publicly. Defense brought up that Garcia was not consistently employed and could gain financially from media attention or civil suits, suggesting resentment or personal grievance toward Combs could have influenced Garcia's version of events. Defense also highlighted inconsistencies in Garcia's timeline and details, discrepancy about when exactly the cash was handed over. Garcia's initial statement placed it before the alleged video suppression, but hotel logs showed a different timing. Conflicting details about who else was present during the exchange. Some hotel staff testified that only Garcia had the bag at the moment. Garcia's description of the brown paper bag context and the exact instruction here. Now, about Ventura's testimony. The defense argued that Ventura could be biased due to past relationship and personal conflicts. Ventura had a highly public and contentious breakup with Combs. Defense introduced text messages, social media posts, and prior civil filings showing ongoing disputes or grievances, and argued that her personal animosity could color her interpretation of Combs' action during the call. They also claimed that Ventura agreed to the management of the video and even requested that hotel staff retain it privately and related to federal proceedings. They presented witnesses and emails showing Ventura coordinating with staff about video privacy. This suggested Combs did not coerce or direct suppression. He was acting within Ventura's consent. They also argued Ventura's memory was inconsistent and unreliable. Cross-examination highlighted differences in Ventura's recollection across interviews, depositions, and court testimony. Example, timing of the call, what was said, and who else was present varied. Experts on memory and testimony were cited to show human memory errors, especially in emotionally charged situations. The defense emphasized that intent to obstruct justice requires clear, willful action, which was not established given her inconsistent accounts. They also claimed that prosecution exaggerated the significance of the recording. The video depicted a personal dispute, not a federal proceeding-related act. Even if Combs had influence over the video, it was not necessarily an obstruction of a federal investigation, only relevant to civil or personal matters. The defense won and the charge was dropped pre-trial. Now on to the next charge, racketeering conspiracy. It criminalizes participation in or conspiracy to participate in an enterprise engaged in a pattern of racketeering activities. A pattern of racketeering activity requires at least 2 predicate acts from a defined list of crimes, e.g., bribery, obstruction, murder, kidnapping, sex trafficking, money laundering, etc. In order to convict under this law, the prosecution must be able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that there was a legally recognizable organization or enterprise, that the defendant knowingly agreed to participate in the conduct of the enterprise's affairs. They must also prove that the enterprise engaged in at least 2 predicate acts within a 10-year period, and also prove that the defendant knew about the enterprise and intended to further its unlawful goal. To prove this, the prosecution had material evidence that was collected in search warrants and seizures, which included narcotics and weapons, among other things. They also had CCTV footage and financial records and payments to escorts, and witness testimonies from people like Ventura. Now, to how the defense countered this, starting from search warrants and seizures. The defense argued that some items, particularly the narcotics and weapons, were legally possessed or unrelated to any enterprise activities. They argued that seizure reports and chain of custody logs had inconsistencies, raising questions about reliability. They also suggested the presence of items like baby oil and lubricants were innocuous or unrelated to illegal activities. The court evaluated that while the items existed, the connection to a RICO enterprise required proving intent and coordinated criminal activity. Now on to the video evidence CCTV footage. The defense alleged the chain of custody and authenticity. Multiple staff handled the recording with possible gaps. They argued that actions shown did not demonstrate enterprise-level criminal activity, only personal disputes. They also suggested that the prosecution overstated the significance of the footage in proving racketeering. Court evaluated that the footage supported predicate acts like obstruction or abuse, but could not alone prove racketeering conspiracy without corroborating evidence. Now on to financial records and payment to escorts. The defense claimed the financial transactions were mischaracterized. Payments were either gifts, bonuses, or unrelated personal expenses. They questioned the reliability of records linking Combs directly to illegal payments. Cross-examination of male escorts focused on possible bias or motive for exaggeration, including compensation for media interviews. Some testimony held partial weight, but direct connection to conspiracy was not conclusively proven. The evidence was successfully debunked, and the defense won, getting that charge successfully dropped. Now on to the next charge: sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. The federal law makes it a crime to recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, or maintain a person for a commercial sex act, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that force, threats, fraud, or coercion will be used to cause the person to engage in the act, or the person is under the age of 18. The prosecution needed to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, or maintained a person for commercial sex. The defendant knew or recklessly disregarded the force, fraud, or coercion would be used to cause participation in the act. They also needed to prove that the activity was in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce, any payment, exchange, or transaction surfaces. And lastly, they also needed to prove that the victim was either coerced or, if under 18, consent is legally irrelevant. Key legal point: even if someone consented, if force, fraud, or coercion was present, the consent does not negate liability under this law. The law is broad. The defendant does not need to physically carry out every step, i.e. recruitment or payment. Being part of the venture that engages in this trafficking act is enough. To support these claims, the prosecution brought alleged victims to testify. They also provided Ventura's bruise photos and text messages, which were meant to prove coercion and use of force. Now, on to how defense debunked these theories. The defense argued that several alleged victims had voluntarily engaged in relationships or encounters with Combs, blurring the line between consensual adult behavior and trafficking. They emphasized that benefits such as gifts, travel, or money were not proof of coercion, but part of consensual arrangements common in celebrity circles. The defense also highlighted inconsistencies in witness timelines, i.e. differing dates about when trips or parties occurred. They also suggested financial motives. Some witnesses had civil suits pending against Combs, implying their testimony could be influenced by the prospect of monetary gain. They also brought up prior dispute with Combs, framing them as potential grudges. On the text messages, the defense pointed out that many replies from alleged victims used casual or even playful language, suggesting willingness rather than resistance. They also pointed out ambiguity of tone. Messages like "be here at 8" were argued to be scheduling rather than commands backed by threat. They also said there was no explicit coercion. None of the text contained clear threats like "if you don't, X will happen," or deceptive promises that could be tied directly to fraud. They also pointed out celebrity lifestyle context. The defense emphasized that strict scheduling, travel demands, and sexual overtones are common in entourages around high-profile celebrities, making the text more indicative of consensual arrangements than trafficking. And here is the court's take. The text confirmed interaction but lacked explicit proof of force, fraud, or coercion. The statutory elements, they supported context, not criminal intent. Now on to Ventura bruise photos and why they didn't seal the case. The defense stressed that Ventura never filed a police report or medical complaint at the time of the injuries. They argued bruises could have come from consensual rough encounters, accidents, or unrelated incidents. Without medical verification, their origin remained speculative. They also pointed on timing issues. Cross-examination revealed some bruises' dates were uncertain. with metadata inconsistencies that raised questions about when and how the images were taken. Also, the defense reinforced Ventura's strained personal history with Combs, suggesting she had motive to exaggerate or reinterpret consensual acts or coercive. And here is the court take. The bruise photos were emotionally impactful but insufficient without corroboration. They lacked medical, police, or third-party confirmation, and hence they could not prove beyond reasonable doubt. So yet again, the defense won. This charge was acquitted. Now on to the last two charges which I believe were convicted: transportation to engage in prostitution, Mann Act, count 1 and 2. It is illegal to knowingly transport any individual across state lines with the intent that the individual engage in prostitution or any sexual activities for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense. For the prosecutors to secure a conviction under this law, they must prove all the following beyond reasonable doubt: that the defendant knowingly transported or caused to be transported another person across state lines, i.e. by car, plane, or arranging travel. They also must prove that at the time of transportation, the defendant knew the person would be engaging in prostitution or unlawful sexual activities. Prosecution must also prove the dominant motive or purpose of the trip was for prostitution or sexual activities that violates the law. Though this is not required, they would strengthen the case by proving that there was force, fraud, or coercion. The prosecution provided evidence, including travel records, airline tickets, and hotel receipts allegedly purchased under Sean Combs or his team's names. Records showed a woman flown from New York to Miami in 2018. Bank transfers and Zelle payments to the woman soon after the trip. There were text messages between Combs' staff and the woman referencing parties and arrangements. Some messages allegedly mentioned payments for company during travel. There also are witness testimonies, including Jane, who testified she was invited to Miami by Combs' associate. She claimed the trip was arranged so she could attend a private party and perform these acts in exchange for money. She said she felt pressured but admitted she wasn't physically forced. Another testimony from an assistant of former employee testified that arranging flights and accommodation for women was common practice in Combs' circle. Also suggested everyone knew these trips were for sex work. There was also a supporting witness, a friend of Jane, who claimed that Jane confided in her before and after the trip that she was going down to Miami for Combs' party and it wasn't free. Now let's see defense strategies and how the court responded to it. About travel records and hotel receipts, defense argued that flights and hotels were for legitimate social events, not prostitution. Witness attended music industry events and parties that were unrelated to sex work. Court response: travel documents alone do not prove intent. The prosecution needed corroborating evidence. On to evidence number 2, financial transaction. The defense argued payments were gifts or reimbursement for personal expenses. No notes or messages explicitly tied the funds to the acts. The court responded that without clear linkage, payments were circumstantial and insufficient alone to prove the criminal intent. Digital evidence. The text messages. Defense argued that messages mentioning arrangement or parties were vague and open to interpretation. Chain of custody issues were raised. Messages could have been selectively preserved. The court responded that text was suggestive but did not conclusively prove transportation for prostitution. Evidence number 4. Primary witness, Jane. The defense argument. She admitted she was not physically forced. Cross-examination revealed inconsistencies about timing and purpose of the trip. They also suggested witness could exaggerate due to civil suits potential or personal biases. Jury could not determine beyond a reasonable doubt that the trip's dominant purpose was prostitution. Now on to the assistant. The defense argued that staff testimony was anecdotal and lacked first-hand observation of illegal acts. On to Jane's friend testimony. The defense argued it cannot independently prove intent, as this one was a second-hand testimony. The court responded saying they would treat it as corroborative only. Using all the evidence and bits and pieces of this charge, the prosecution won. These two charges, I believe you can get 15 to 20 years of sentence. Both prosecution and the defense gave out their submission in written form, and I'm going to read them out to you so we can find out. Defense submission. The objective: The defense aims to secure a reduced sentence, proposing no more than 14 months in prison, which could allow Combs to be released almost immediately if the judge agrees. They argued that Combs had been incarcerated for nearly 13 months under difficult conditions, including constant surveillance, threats, health issues, and limited access to basic necessities. His legal team argues that this period, coupled up with harsh conditions, constitute a significant punishment. They also said the jury acquitted Combs from more serious charges, including racketeering and sex trafficking, which could have resulted in a life sentence. The defense contends that these acquittals should be considered in mitigation, suggesting that the convictions on the Mann Act charges are less severe. They also pointed out rehabilitation and positive conduct. Combs has reportedly become sober for the first time in 25 years and has expressed remorse, acknowledging the harm caused by his former behavior. He is also involved in teaching other inmates business and personal development skills, indicating a positive change in his career. They also mentioned of personal and career hardships. The defense highlights the significant impact on Combs' personal life and career, including the collapse of his business empire, the cancellation of a Hulu show, and reputational damage affecting his family. Over 100 employees lost their jobs as a result. They also said Combs denied a plea deal that would have recommended prison sentence of at least 25 years. The defense argues that this decision demonstrates his commitment to contesting the charges and his belief in his innocence. Now on to prosecution submission. Their main objective was seeking a substantially longer prison term, emphasizing the seriousness of the convictions and the need for deterrence. Their key arguments were each Mann Act charge carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. The prosecution argues that these are serious offenses that warrant significant punishment regardless of the acquittals on more severe charges. The prosecution emphasizes that the need for a sentence that serves as a deterrent to others and protects the public. They argue that Combs' status and influence make it crucial to impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of his actions. The prosecution disputes the defense claim regarding hardship and rehabilitation, arguing that the factors do not negate the need for a substantial prison term. They assert that time served does not match the gravity of the offense. They also said the prosecution underscores that the jury found sufficient evidence to convict Combs on the Mann Act charges. They argue that these convictions should be taken seriously and result in a significant sentence. It should also be noted that Combs' lawyer tried to get Combs out on bail as he awaits his sentencing on October 3rd, and the judge refused. However, if the judge ends up ruling in their favor, it's possible that they would consider time served, which would mean Sean Combs would be free